to the third life science lesson. In the previous lesson, we have talked about how plants respond by coordinating different physiological activities to different types of stimuli around them. In this lesson, we are going to discuss the third part of the first chapter, which is response and chemical coordination in animals with special reference to animal hormones. In the previous class, we've talked about plant hormones or phytohormones, and in this class we are going to talk about animal hormones. And here we are going to look at how animals, with the help of these different chemicals in their bodies known as hormones, are able to coordinate different physiological processes in their bodies in order to generate responses to different types of stimuli in their environment. Now, to begin with, let us begin by understanding the word coordination. Coordination means to organize different processes together in such a way that they perform efficiently simultaneously. That means they work together efficiently, and that is known as coordination. For example, we are performing different processes in our bodies like respiration, digestion, circulation. All these processes are taking place in our body together at the same time, and they are taking place efficiently. So we can say that we are coordinating different processes in our body. Similarly, in animals, these different chemical substances, which are known as hormones, they are able to coordinate other physiological processes in the bodies of animals. So, now, when we talk about physiological processes that are controlled by hormones, what are physiological processes, we must ask. So, physiological processes are those processes that are crucial or integral for the survival of the organism. They can also be known as functional life processes. So, what are these processes? Let us look at them. Let us start with growth. Growth is one of those processes which is fundamental or which is crucial for the survival of the organism. An organism must grow for its survival. Second is metabolism. Metabolism refers to the sum total of all the chemical reactions taking place in our bodies. It involves two other processes, which are catabolism, which is the breakdown of substances in our body, and anabolism, which is the building up of these different components to produce, say, different substances in our bodies. So, catabolism, which is breakdown, and anabolism, which is build up, together constitute metabolism. And in order to survive, we must perform metabolism. Next is blood pressure. Now, since blood flows in these enclosed spaces known as blood vessels, naturally there will be a pressure that develops within these blood vessels, and this pressure has to be maintained at an optimum level. If the pressure exceeds the optimum level, we come across different types of problems, high blood pressure and other sorts of disorders. And if the pressure is below the optimum level, we come across other types of problems. Similarly, next we have blood glucose levels, which refers to the amount of sugar or glucose present in our blood. Now, like blood pressure, blood glucose also must be present at an optimum level. If the blood glucose levels exceed the optimum levels, we have different problems such as diabetes mellitus. And if the blood glucose levels falls below the optimum level, we come across several other problems. Next, we have erection of body hair for heat retention or during excitement. Now, since we are mammals, we have hair across our bodies. And this hair tends to stand up or become erect whenever we feel cold. In order to retain the heat in our bodies, the hair in our bodies will be erect so that it can trap a layer of air between our bodies and the environment, and that layer of air acts as an insulant, or it gives us insulation, so that it does not allow the heat inside our bodies to escape, and it also doesn't allow the cold from the outside to enter. And similarly, erection of body hair can also occur during moments of excitement or anxiety or fear, and this is also controlled by hormones. And lastly, one of the most important physiological processes controlled by hormones are the development of reproductive organs. Now, reproduction is a very, very important biological process without which the continuation of species cannot be maintained. The continuity of life itself cannot be maintained without reproduction. So in order for reproduction to occur, the individual organisms must have well-developed reproductive organs, and reproductive organs, the development of these reproductive organs are brought about by the action of different types of hormones in our bodies. So these are the different physiological processes which are controlled by these chemical substances present in the bodies of animals or in our bodies as well, known as hormones. So it is very, very important to keep in mind these physiological processes. Now, after having discussed these physiological processes, let us look at some of the organs involved with regard to hormones. So, we are going to discuss about special types of, a particularly special type of organ in our body with regard to hormones known as glands. Now, what are glands? Glands are organs which produce and release chemical substances naturally, and these chemical substances which are produced by the glands perform specific functions in the organism's body. So, looking at this definition, we can come to know that glands are organs that perform two functions. One is to produce the chemical substance, and number two is to release the chemical substances. Now, based on what chemical substance they produce, glands can be divided into two different types. The first one being exocrine glands and the other one being endocrine glands. Now, in order to properly understand hormones and their functions, we must understand the glands first. So, let us look at the differences between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Now, endocrine glands and exocrine glands can be differentiated based on three criteria. The first of the criteria is presence or absence of ducts. Ducts meaning pipes or passages. Now, endocrine glands do not have ducts. They are known as ductless glands. That is why it is written here, ducts are absent. Comparatively, if you look at exocrine glands are glands that have ducts. So, thus, ducts are present. The second criteria of difference is the secretory products themselves, the chemical substances that are produced and secreted by these glands. If we look at endocrine glands, the endocrine glands produce and secrete chemical substances known as hormones, which we are going to discuss in this lesson. Comparatively, if you look at exocrine glands, they produce and release other chemical substances known as enzymes. Enzymes and hormones are different from one another. Enzymes are involved in particularly your digestive system. For example, salivary amylase is one such enzyme. However, we are going to talk about only hormones in this lesson. And the third criteria of difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands is the transport of these secretions. How are the secretions or how are these chemical substances produced by these glands transported? If we look at endocrine glands are ductless glands. They don't have ducts, as I've already told you earlier. So, the chemical substances produced by them, which are hormones, are transported using the circulatory system, particularly the blood and the lymph, because ducts are absent. Very, very simple. Comparatively, if we look at exocrine glands, since they have ducts are present with endocrine glands, the secretions of exocrine glands, the enzymes produced by the exocrine glands are transported through these ducts. So these are the three differences between endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Now, for this lesson, we are only going to talk about endocrine glands. We are not going to talk about exocrine glands. However, it is important to know the differences. Moving on, now let us come to the proper definition of hormones. It is very, very important to understand the definition of hormones or to learn the definition of hormones. In the previous lesson, when we were talking with regard to phytohormones or plant hormones, we had looked at the definition of phytohormones and we had seen 4 important points with regard to the definition of phytohormones. Those same 4 points are involved in this definition as well. However, you have to be able to change a few words. So let us look at the 4 points first. The first point being hormones are chemical messengers. They are chemical substances which carry messages from one part of the body to another. Second is they are produced in small quantities like phytohormones from endocrine glands, from the glands that we've discussed earlier, these ductless glands known as endocrine glands. Number 3, since the endocrine glands do not have ducts, they are transported via blood and lymph to the target organs being those parts of our bodies where the hormones need to perform their function. And last point is when they reach the target organs, the hormones coordinate, they organize different physiological processes. Now, which physiological processes we've already seen in the earlier slides. So these 4 points, if you can remember, then it is easy to look at the definition. If we look at these 4 points, the same 4 points are given in this definition. Hormones are chemical substances naturally produced and secreted by a gland, particularly the endocrine gland, in small quantities, which are transported by blood and lymph to a target organ where they control various physiological activities. So in order to learn the definition of hormones, you must know these 4 points, and these same 4 points are applicable to phytohormones, which we discussed in the previous lesson. Now if you look here, this flowchart gives you a proper idea of how hormones function. If you look at the left hand side, you can see the source. The source of hormones are endocrine glands, the ductless glands which are present in our body. They produce as well as release or secrete these hormones. Once they are secreted, they have to be transported to the target organ, and since endocrine glands do not have ducts, these hormones are transported via blood and lymph, as you can see in the arrow, and blood and lymph take these hormones to a place known as, or different regions in our bodies known as target organs, which are also known as site of action, because it is there in the target organ that the hormones perform their functions, which is to coordinate different physiological processes. Now, let us look at the characteristics of hormones. What characteristics do hormones possess? Number 1 is source. We've already discussed it earlier. The source of hormones are endocrine glands. Number 2 is chemical nature. What is their chemical composition? What are these hormones chemically composed of? So number 1 is proteinaceous. They are made up of different types of proteins. And which hormones are proteinaceous? Example given is growth hormone. Number 2 is amine based. So which hormones are amine based? You can see they are adrenaline and thyroxine. The third type of hormone based on chemical nature is steroidal. Steroidal meaning they are derived from cholesterol, substances present in blood known as cholesterol. And steroidal hormones, the examples are testosterone, which is the male sex hormone, and progesterone and estrogen, which are the 2 female sex hormones. And lastly, we have lipid based hormones, meaning to say that they are derived from fat, and these are prostaglandins. So based on chemical nature, you can have 4 types of hormones: proteinaceous hormones, amine based hormones, steroidal hormones, and lipid hormones. Next, transportation. How are hormones transported? As we've already discussed earlier, hormones are transported via blood and lymph. Why? Because endocrine glands do not have ducts. Next, moving on to the function. We have also discussed the function earlier, which is to regulate or to coordinate different physiological processes, and they do that in small quantities, or perhaps it is better to use the word optimum quantities or optimum levels. Optimum meaning the right level. If the amount of hormones exceeds the optimum level, we come across different disorders. If it is below the optimum levels, then we come across other different types of disorders. And lastly, their fate. What happens to the hormones after their use? Like phytohormones, they are destroyed after the completion of their function. Hence, we need to continuously manufacture or produce these hormones in our bodies. So with that, let us move on to the next slide. Here, we can see the differences between plant hormones that we discussed in the previous class and animal hormones, which we are going to discuss in this lesson. Now, we can differentiate plant hormones and animal hormones based on 4 criteria. The first of which is the site of secretion, or where they are secreted from. If you look at plant hormones, they are secreted from portions known as meristematic tissues, or the growing parts of the plant. Whereas animal hormones, as we've discussed earlier, are secreted from endocrine glands. Number 2, the second point of difference is transportation. Plant hormones are transported via the sap in the xylem, which is a part of the conducting system. Whereas animal hormones are transported via blood and lymph of the circulatory system. Point number 3 is the nature, or to be more precise, chemical nature. Plant hormones are acidic or basic in their chemical nature, whereas if you look at animal hormones, which we've already discussed earlier, they may be proteinaceous, amine-based, steroidal, or lipid-based. And finally, last but not least, the fourth point of difference is application, and this is perhaps one of the most important criteria of difference. Application meaning, what is their application? How are they applied in plants and animals respectively? If we look at plant hormones, their application is extensive, meaning that a single hormone can perform several functions. For example, if we look at auxin, which we've discussed in the previous class, auxin is one plant hormone which controls apical dominance. It induces cell division, cell enlargement. It also induces parthenocarpy. It also controls tropic movements. So as you can see, one plant hormone, which is auxin, can perform a variety of functions. But if you look at animal hormones, you can see that animal hormones, the application is highly specific, meaning to say that a single hormone will only perform a single function. It will not perform other functions other than the function that it has to fulfill. So, for example, we can take growth hormone as the example of an animal hormone. Growth hormone brings about growth and development during the lifespan of an individual, of an animal. Apart from growth, bringing a growth and development to the organism's body, growth hormone does not perform any other function. So as you can see, plant hormones, their application is very, very extensive. Comparatively, animal hormones, their application is highly specific. Now, my dear students, let us look at a flow chart that helps us understand the functioning of the endocrine system, the system involving hormones in animals. Now, if we look at the flow chart, there are 4 levels, as you can see. The topmost level is comprised of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is present in our forebrain. It is a part of the forebrain, that means the front part of the brain. The hypothalamus releases a group of hormones known as releasing hormones. As you can see, the releasing hormones are given in blue. We shall talk about the full forms in the coming slides. Now, there are 4 releasing hormones that are produced and secreted by the hypothalamus. Apart from these 4 hormones, the hypothalamus also produces 2 other hormones, vasopressin and oxytocin, which are given on the right hand side. Now, these 2 hormones, although they are produced by the hypothalamus, they are stored in the pituitary, which is at the second level. Now, the hypothalamus, with the help of the releasing hormones, it controls the second level of the endocrine system, which is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland can be divided into 2 parts: anterior pituitary, which is the front part, and the posterior pituitary, which is the back part. The anterior pituitary is actually controlled by the releasing hormones, which were actually released by the hypothalamus. Now, under the influence of the releasing hormones, the anterior pituitary produces and secretes a group of hormones known as tropic hormones, which are given here in green. Apart from the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary, the back part of the pituitary, is not under the influence of the hypothalamus. It only stores the 2 hormones that were actually produced by the hypothalamus, which are vasopressin and oxytocin, and secretes those 2 hormones. Now, the pituitary controls the third level of the endocrine system, which are the different endocrine glands in our body. So, all of these endocrine glands in our body are actually under the influence of the tropic hormones, which are actually secreted by the pituitary. So there are different types of endocrine glands. For example, we have the adrenal glands, we have the thyroid gland, we have the gonads or the primary sex organs, which are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. And similarly, we can have other endocrine glands, which we are going to discuss later in the coming slides. And the hormones that are secreted by these endocrine glands are the ones that actually go to the different target organs in our body and coordinate the different physiological processes. So from this chart, you can see that the main center for coordination is the hypothalamus with regard to the endocrine system. Hypothalamus controls the pituitary. The pituitary then, with the help of the different tropic hormones, is able to control the different endocrine glands, because of which pituitary is also known as the master gland. And the hormones that are secreted from the endocrine glands are actually the hormones that actually go to the target organs. Now with this, let us look at the feedback control system. Now, in order to understand the feedback control system, we first must understand that hormones, as I've told you earlier, function at an optimum level. If the amount of hormones drops below the optimum level, we come across different disorders. If it exceeds the optimum level, we come across other disorders. So it is important to maintain the optimum level of these hormones in our body, and that is done with the help of the feedback control system. Now what happens here is, we have already seen that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary in turn controls the different endocrine glands, and the endocrine glands thus release the enzyme which go to the different target organs in order to control or coordinate different physiological activities. Now, let us take the example of the hormone known as thyroxine. Now, if thyroxine levels increase in our body, that means it sends a message to the hypothalamus saying that thyroxine is now being secreted in excess, we need to reduce it. So thalamus then decreases a releasing hormone, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. It is one of the releasing hormones that is secreted by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus decreases the amount of TSH/RH, which then stimulates the pituitary to a lesser extent and stimulates the pituitary to secrete less of thyroid stimulating hormone, which is a tropic hormone secreted by the pituitary. If thyroid stimulating hormone levels go down or decrease, it stimulates the thyroid gland, which is the endocrine gland, to a lesser extent, and thus thyroid gland decreases its secretion of thyroxine, thus thereby balancing out the level of thyroxine and maintaining it to an optimum level. Similarly, if thyroxine is in deficit, what happens is that sends a message to the hypothalamus saying that thyroxine is in deficit, our body needs more of thyroxine. What does the hypothalamus do then? Hypothalamus in turn increases the secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone. Now, because of which it stimulates the pituitary to a greater extent, and pituitary secretes more of thyroid stimulating hormone. If thyroid stimulating hormone levels increase, it stimulates the thyroid gland to a much greater extent and thus makes the thyroid gland secrete more of thyroxine, thereby balancing out the level of thyroxine in our bodies. So as you can see, this mechanism where the level of the hormone regulates how much of it is secreted from the gland itself, this mechanism is known as the feedback control. And so thus, let us look at the definition of feedback control. Feedback control is a mechanism, it denotes a mechanism when the product from a gland, which is the hormone itself, has regulatory role or controls the secretion from the gland itself. So this is the feedback control system. The function of the feedback control system is to maintain the hormone levels at an optimum level in our bodies. Now moving on to the next slide, this diagram gives us a visual representation of the different endocrine glands present in the male and the female bodies. Now some of these organs that are given in this diagram, some of these glands are not there in the madhyamik syllabus. We will look at those that are actually there. Now if you look right at the top at the brain, we have the pineal gland, which is not there in the syllabus. However, we do have hypothalamus and the pituitary. As you can see, hypothalamus and pituitary, both of which are present in the brain. Hypothalamus slightly above the pituitary. If we come to the neck region, we can see the thyroid gland in both the male and the female. They are present at the root of the neck. Below the thyroid, we have parathyroid and thymus, which are not particularly there in your syllabus. Below that, we have the adrenal cortex right above each kidney. You have these yellow triangular cap-like structures. Those are your adrenal glands. They are a very important endocrine gland. Below the adrenal glands, you have your kidneys, and in between the two kidneys, you can see a transverse gland that is known as the pancreas. Now, pancreas is also one of the more important endocrine glands which we are going to discuss. Now, up till the pancreas, all the endocrine glands are similar in males and females. However, if we look below the waist, that is where you will see significant differences in the endocrine glands present in both males and females. If you look at the female on the left hand side, you can see that the female has ovaries and the uterus. Here, the ovaries are the primary sex organs in females. The ovaries are responsible for the production of the gametes, which are known as ovum in singular, ova in plural. And it is also responsible for the secretion of the female sex hormones, which are progesterone and estrogen respectively. However, if you look at the males have testes. Testes are the male primary reproductive organs, and they are responsible for the production of the male gametes known as sperms, and also the production of the male sex hormone known as testosterone. So this is a visual representation of the different endocrine glands present in males and females. With that, let us look at hypothalamus, the first level of the endocrine system. Now, hypothalamus is located in the forebrain below the thalamus. If you look at the diagram of the brain here, you have the thalamus, which is the white portion there right in the center. Right below the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus, and right under the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary gland. In fact, the name itself, hypothalamus, means below the thalamus. Now here, hypothalamus secretes a group of hormones known as releasing hormones. Now, what are these releasing hormones? These are given in green color. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, releasing hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, releasing hormone. Growth hormone, releasing hormone. And gonadotropin, releasing hormone. These are the four releasing hormones. They are known as releasing hormones because they influence the pituitary to release another group of hormones, particularly the anterior pituitary to release tropic hormones. Now, apart from these four releasing hormones, you have two other hormones which are actually produced by the hypothalamus, which we've talked about earlier. Vasopressin, which is also known as the antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, both of which are given in blue here. Now, vasopressin and oxytocin, although produced by the hypothalamus, are actually stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary, or from the back part of the pituitary. And here you can see hypothalamus controls the hormonal secretions of the anterior pituitary, which is the front part of the pituitary. Here, one thing you must keep in mind is to learn the full forms of these hormones. It is very, very important to learn the full forms of these abbreviations, because oftentimes they ask you the full forms in your Madhyamik exam. So here, this is a diagram which we've already seen. You can see right at the top, the first level is the hypothalamus. There you can see the four releasing hormones, and you can also see vasopressin and oxytocin. Now let us look at the second level, which is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is a pea-shaped gland. It is the size of a pea. It is present below the hypothalamus, as we've already seen in the diagram, and it is enclosed in a small bony cavity known as the sella turcica cavity of the sphenoid bone. Now, if you look at our skull is composed of several bones that are joined together, and these joints are, however, immovable. They cannot be moved. Now, one of these bones is called the sphenoid bone, and within this sphenoid bone there is a bony cavity, a cup-like structure, and that cup-like structure is known as the sella turcica cavity. And it is within this sella turcica cavity that you will find the pituitary gland. Now, pituitary gland is also known as the master gland because it controls or it regulates the secretions of all other endocrine glands. The pituitary gland can be divided into the anterior pituitary, which is the front part, and the posterior pituitary, which is the back part. If we look at the anterior pituitary, The anterior pituitary secretes a group of hormones known as tropic hormones. Now, what are the tropic hormones? As you can see, these are adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, gonadotropic hormone, follicle. Now, gonadotropic hormone or gonadotropin can be divided into two, which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And lastly, we have prolactin. These are the 5 tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are named such because their target organs are other endocrine glands. They influence the hormonal secretions of other endocrine glands. And lastly, we have the posterior pituitary, which is given in blue. The posterior pituitary stores and releases vasopressin, also known as antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, both of which are actually produced in the hypothalamus. Here in this diagram, again in this chart, you can see that the pituitary secretes 5 tropic hormones, which are given in green, and the 2 other hormones, which are vasopressin and oxytocin, which are actually produced by the hypothalamus. Now let us look at the functioning of these tropic hormones. Let us begin with adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, which is a polypeptide hormone. From the name itself, you can make out that adrenocorticotropic hormone controls the hormonal secretions of the adrenal cortex. Hence, it is named adrenocorticotropic hormone. The hypersecretion, or hyper meaning more secretion or secretion in excess of ACTH, causes a disease known as Cushing's disease, whose symptoms include increased blood sugar levels and weakness of muscles, etc. Hyposecretion, meaning to say that lesser secretion or secretion in deficit of adrenocorticotropic hormone, causes another disease known as Addison's disease, which is characterized by fatigue, which is exhaustion, feeling tired all the time, dizziness and nausea, nausea referring to a tendency of vomiting and not feeling well, and etc. So as you can see, hormones have to be secreted at an optimum level, like I've discussed earlier. Hypersecretion or secretion in excess causes different disorders. Hyposecretion or secretion in deficit causes different types of problems. Number 2 is the thyroid stimulating hormone. Now again, from the name itself, you can understand that this hormone controls the secretions of the thyroid gland. It regulates the growth and functioning of the thyroid gland, and it stimulates the thyroid to secrete thyroid hormones, of which we are going to discuss one, which is thyroxine. And it also controls the rate of iodine metabolism, that is the breakdown of metabolism in our bodies. Moving on, let us look at growth hormone. Growth hormone is the only tropic hormone which does not function through a target gland, but exerts its effect directly on the different parts of our bodies. Growth hormone is not transported, although it is a tropic hormone, it does not go to any other endocrine gland. It directly exerts its effects on our body. And what are its effects? It brings about overall growth of the body. It helps in your skeletal and muscular development. It aids in protein and muscle acid synthesis. It helps us to produce different types of muscle acids with the help of proteins. It helps us to metabolize carbohydrates and lipids, which are fats. It also controls blood sugar levels. It reduces the body fat. It helps us to remain lean, and it helps in recovery from different types of injuries or muscle soreness or these different types of injuries that you might get. Growth hormone helps us to recover from them. Now, if we look at the hypersecretion and hypersecretion in childhood, if you have less amount of growth hormone from childhood, if you have a more amount, hyper means more. So if you have excessive growth hormone from childhood, you have a condition known as gigantism, which can be shown in this picture. As you can see, the person in the middle is a person who has gigantism, and you can compare his height to the other people. The other people in this photograph are people with normal height. They are normal adults. And if you look at the person in the center, he has gigantism. He is extremely tall because of hypersecretion of growth hormone from childhood. Hypersecretion only during adulthood. If your growth hormone levels are normal as a child, but when you grow up, if your growth hormone levels increase, it leads to a condition known as acromegaly, which can be characterized by looking at this photo. This is a photo of a famous wrestler. He suffers from acromegaly, and acromegaly is characterized by protrusion of the jaw. There is an overdevelopment of the jaw. You can see the brow line is also exaggerated. You can see that the person is also grows more than a normal human being, but not as much as in gigantism. Next, let us look at the hyposecretion or secretion in deficit. Hyposecretion from childhood leads to a condition known as dwarfism, where a person suffers from stunted growth or retarded growth, where the person doesn't grow physically to the normal height of a normal adult person. His growth is stunted, so he or she looks like a child. However, mental development is normal. And the people here are known as little people, or some people even call them as dwarfs. Next, hyposecretion in adults. If your growth hormone levels are normal in childhood, but if they decrease when you become an adult, it leads to a disease known as Simmons disease, which is characterized by the disintegration of your muscular system. Muscular development has withered away, and you can see in this photograph that this person now only has skin and bones, where the muscular development is totally, he or she lacks total muscular development. So that is with regard to growth hormone. Now let us look at gonadotropic hormone, or the hormone that controls the hormonal secretions of your gonads, your primary sex organs. So here you can see right at the top, it influences the functioning of the gonads. Gonads referring to your primary sex organs, testes in males, ovaries in females. So now I've already told you that gonadotropic hormone has two parts: your follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. But before we understand this, you must understand that follicle stimulating hormone helps the gonads to produce gametes, your sex cells, whereas the luteinizing hormone helps the gonads produce and secrete sex hormones. Now if we look at the left hand side, follicle stimulating hormone, it helps in the production of gametes. Now we have to discuss that with regard to male and female separately. So let us begin with the male. In the male testes, follicle stimulating hormone influences the growth of the seminiferous tubules in the testes and promotes the production and release of sperms. Sperms are produced in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, and follicle stimulating hormone aids in the development of the seminiferous tubules. If the seminiferous tubules develop normally, they are able to produce and release the male sex gametes, male sex cells, or the male gametes known as sperms. If we look at the female ovaries, in the female ovaries, follicle stimulating hormone again influences the growth of the ovaries and the maturation of the ovarian follicles. There are certain cells present in the ovaries known as follicles or ovarian follicles, which give rise to the ovum or the eggs in the female, which represent the female gamete or the female sex cells. And the follicle stimulating hormone not only influences the growth of the ovaries and the maturation of the ovarian follicle, but it also helps in a process known as ovulation, which is the release of the ovum during the menstrual cycle, which results in the release of the female gamete. So this is the function of the follicle stimulating hormone with regard to male and female respectively. Now let us look at the right hand side, the luteinizing hormone, the other part of the gonadotropic hormone. Luteinizing hormone, as I've already told you earlier, helps in the production and release of the sex hormones. In the males, the luteinizing hormone actually stimulates a special type of cell known as the interstitial cell or the Leydig cells. Now, since the luteinizing hormone influences or stimulates the interstitial cell, luteinizing hormone in males can also be referred to as the interstitial cell stimulating hormone, or ICSH in short. Now, in males, the luteinizing hormone or the interstitial cell stimulating hormone influences the interstitial cells to secrete testosterone, which is the male sex hormone. Similarly, if we look at the female counterpart, which is in the ovaries, luteinizing hormone promotes the final maturation of the ovarian follicle and secretion of estrogen. When the ovarian follicle present inside the ovule matures to its final stage, it also secretes the female hormone known as estrogen. Apart from that, once the ovarian follicle is mature, it ruptures, it bursts open. When it bursts open, it releases the egg. Once the egg is released, the portion that has ruptured is known as the corpus luteum. It is the corpus luteum that secretes the second female sex hormone known as progesterone. So, luteinizing hormone in females promotes the final maturation of the ovarian follicle, leading to the release of estrogen, the first female hormone, and it also leads to the formation of corpus luteum, the ruptured follicle, which aids in the secretion of the second female sex hormone, which is progesterone. So this is a summary of the gonadotropic hormone, which has two components, which is the follicle stimulating hormone, which aids in the production and release of gametes, and luteinizing hormone, which aids in the production and release of the sex hormones in males and females respectively. Now moving on to the next slide, let us look at now the different types of endocrine glands. Now we are at the third level. We have discussed the hypothalamus, we have discussed the pituitary. Now we come to the third level, which are the different types of endocrine glands. To begin, let us look at the thyroid gland. Now the thyroid gland is a gland that is present at the root of the throat, which I have already told you earlier. It has two lateral lobes. That means it has two lobes or two parts that are present side by side, laterally. One on either side of the trachea, which is the windpipe. The two lobes are joined by a small tissue known as an isthmus, and it releases a hormone known as thyroxine. In order to better understand the structure of thyroid gland, let us look at this diagram. You can see that the pink colored gland is the thyroid gland. It has two lobes on either side of the trachea. You can see the windpipe in the middle. On the right side you can see the right lobe, on the left hand side you can see the left lobe. And right at the center, the two lobes are joined together by a small tissue known as the isthmus. Now what does thyroxine do? It helps in growth by influencing a process known as cell differentiation. Cell differentiation is a process when a newly divided cell assumes a particular function and becomes different from the other cells around it. Number two, it also increases your metabolism, increases your basal metabolic rate, and when your metabolism increases, your oxygen consumption will also increase. Thirdly, it helps in the development of the nervous system. Nervous system meaning your brain, your spinal cord, and the different nerves. By developing the nervous system, it helps in increasing the sensitiveness of the brain and the central nervous system. So these are the different functions of thyroxine. Now let us look at the hypersecretion and hyposecretion of thyroxine. Hypersecretion of thyroxine leads to a disease known as Graves' disease, which is characterized by exophthalmic goiter, which is a swelling of the thyroid gland, which leads to a large swelling at the base of the neck. The second is hyposecretion in children. If you have low levels of thyroxine as a child, you will have something known as cretinism. Now, cretinism is a disorder which leads to the person having stunted growth. Physical growth is stunted or retarded. And it also can sometimes lead to mental retardation and other mental issues with the mental health of the person. And lastly, we have hyposecretion in adults, which means to say when you have deficit of thyroxine as an adult, you have a condition known as myxedema, or which is characterized by a simple goiter, which is also a swelling at the base of the neck. It also results in your skin becoming extremely dry and flaky like scales. So that is myxedema. Now this is we have discussed now the thyroid gland, which secretes thyroxine. We have looked at the functions of thyroxine and what happens when it is secreted in excess and deficit. Now moving on, let us look at the adrenal gland. I've already told you earlier that adrenal gland is one of the important endocrine glands in our body. Adrenal gland is situated on the upper pole or on the top part of each kidney. Hence, it is known as a suprarenal gland. Supra meaning above, renal referring to the kidneys. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that the adrenal gland is a triangular gland which is present on the upper pole, on the upper part of each kidney. Now, the adrenal gland can be divided into two parts. It has an outer portion called the cortex and an inner portion known as the medulla. Let us begin by looking at the medulla. Now, the medulla secretes two hormones, namely adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenaline can also be referred to as epinephrine, and noradrenaline can be referred to as norepinephrine. Now, let us look at adrenaline first. Adrenaline is also known as the fight or flight hormone. It is an emergency hormone. It is secreted in times of emergency when a person has to either confront a situation or run away from a situation. Hence the name fight or flight. Now, what does adrenaline do? In times of an emergency, when you are threatened or when your life is threatened, these are the different physiological processes that are controlled by adrenaline. Number one, it increases your heart rate and cardiac output. Naturally, if your heart rate increases, the amount of blood that is pumped by the heart, which is known as cardiac output, also increases. Number two is it increases the rate and depth of respiration. It increases the rate at which you respire and also the depth of respiration. You start breathing deeper and faster. Number three, it increases the tone and efficiency of the muscles and does not allow the muscles to tire out. It allows your muscles to perform a task which it allows your muscles not to tire out while performing the task when adrenaline is secreted. So if you decide to confront the situation and you are supposed to do some activity, then your muscles are kept ready for that activity. Or if you are to run away from the situation, then your muscles are also again kept ready to run away. And lastly, blood flow is directed to the muscles and internal organs and away from the skin. As a result, the person looks pale when adrenaline is secreted because all the blood from the skin is directed to the muscles, so that now the muscles are now ready to do any type of work that is needed to be done. So these are the different physiological processes that are brought about by the secretion of adrenaline in times of emergency. Now the other hormone secreted by the medulla of the adrenal gland is noradrenaline. Noradrenaline also assists adrenaline during times of emergency. It causes the constriction of blood vessels. The blood vessels become constricted. It causes the contraction of smooth muscles of the spleen. It also increases metabolism and it widens the passage to the lungs, increasing inspiration, because earlier, as we've seen with adrenaline, your respiration rate increases. So these are the different functions controlled by adrenaline and noradrenaline during times of emergency when they are secreted from the adrenal medulla. Now if you look at the adrenal cortex, it secretes a group of hormones known as the corticoid hormones, or simply corticoids. Now there are different types of corticoids. We can have mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids and sex corticoids. Now since not much has been elaborated in your syllabus, we will not be diving deep into adrenal cortex. Now my dear students, let us discuss the endocrine gland known as pancreas. Now before we discuss pancreas, let me first help you understand an important concept. Now, whenever we eat food, food can be divided into three groups. You have carbohydrates, you have proteins and fats. Now, proteins and fats together are known as non-carbohydrates. Now, firstly, let us look at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, when we ingest carbohydrates in your stomach, they are first broken down to the simplest form, which is glucose. Now, glucose is used glucose is broken down in our body to generate energy for different purposes. Now glucose, it is used to generate energy, but the glucose that is not used cannot be stored as glucose. It has to be stored in the form of glycogen. Now glucose is converted to glycogen by a particular hormone known as insulin in a process known as glycogenesis. glyco referring to glycogen, genesis meaning creation. So again, insulin is the hormone that converts glucose to glycogen in a process called glycogenesis. So therefore, insulin decreases the amount of glucose in our blood by converting it into glycogen and storing it in our bodies. Now, whenever we require more energy to do different activities, we reconvert or we break down glycogen to form glucose again, so that we can again break down glucose to generate energy. Now, glycogen is converted back to glucose by another hormone known as glucagon in a process known as glycogenolysis. Here, glycogeno referring to glycogen, lysis meaning breakdown. So, glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen to glucose by a hormone known as glucagon. So now glucagon does just the opposite to that of insulin. It increases the blood glucose levels in our bodies. However, now in a situation where we do not have glucose, we also do not have glycogen, then how do we get energy? When we do not have glucose and glycogen, our body begins to break down non-carbohydrate sources, which are actually proteins and fats, and converts them to glucose so that we can generate energy from that glucose. So now, the conversion of non-carbohydrates to glucose occurs in a process called neoglucogenesis by, again, glucagon. So therefore you can see insulin decreases the amount of glucose in our blood. Glucagon does just the opposite. It increases the amount of glucose in our blood. Now, why are we talking about insulin and glucagon? Because they are both secreted by the gland which we are going to talk about, which is pancreas. Now, pancreas is a very, very interesting gland. Pancreas is present at the duodenal loop, meaning to say that if you look at this diagram, you can see the stomach. The stomach extends down through a loop, and after the loop ends, you can see duodenum. Duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. Now, the loop that is present between the stomach and the duodenum is known as the duodenal loop, and it is behind the duodenal loop that the pancreas originates. So, pancreas now, one of the most important points you need to understand is pancreas is a mixed gland. Mixed meaning that it is both endocrine as well as exocrine in function. As an endocrine gland, it secretes glucagon and insulin, which are the two hormones. As an exocrine gland, it secretes pancreatic juice, which is an enzyme involved in the process of digestion. Now, pancreas, it contains certain cells that are scattered in groups known as the islets of Langerhans. Now, these special cells called islets of Langerhans have again two types of cells, alpha cells and beta cells. Now, alpha cells are the ones that secrete glucagon, and beta cells are the ones that secrete insulin. Alpha cells, which secrete glucagon. Now, glucagon, let us look at its function. It promotes glycogenolysis, which is the conversion of glycogen to glucose, and neoglucogenesis, which is the conversion of non-carbohydrates to glucose. It increases thereby blood glucose levels, because you are converting glycogen and non-carbohydrate sources into glucose. So the amount of glucose in your blood increases. It also activates lipase enzyme. Lipase enzyme is an enzyme that breaks down fat in the adipose tissue. So these are the functions of glucagon. Comparatively, if you look at insulin, insulin absorbs glucose from the intestines and promotes glycogenesis. That means it absorbs the glucose that we have digested and converts the glucose into glycogen. It brings down blood sugar levels and it helps in the storage of fats. It also prevents neoglucogenesis, which is the conversion of non-carbohydrate sources to glucose. So as you can see, insulin and glucagon together, they help to regulate the glucose levels in our blood. Now, if either one of these two hormones are in deficit or are in excess, that will cause different types of problems. Moving on, let us look at the last endocrine gland that we are going to discuss. They are the gonads. Now, I have already told you earlier, gonads produce gametes and also release sex hormones. Gonads are also known as your primary sex organs. They are the testes in males and the ovaries in females. So, gonads, they are the primary sex organs, testes in males and ovaries in females. If you look at the left hand side, given in blue are the ovaries of the females, and on the right hand side, given in red, are the testes of the males. If you look at the ovaries have two functions, as I've already told you earlier, which is the maturation of the ovarian follicles leading to the release of the egg or the female gamete. Number two, release of the female sex hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone respectively. If we look at estrogen helps in the development of sex organs, the female sex organs. It also helps in the development of secondary sexual characters. Secondary sexual characters are those characters that differentiate a female from a male apart from the genitals. Like, for example, a development of breasts, wider hips, higher register of voice, a more slender structure of the body, less muscular development. These are all secondary sexual characters of females, which are brought about by estrogen. Estrogen also brings about the maturation of the ovarian follicles, which leads to the release of the female gamete, which is the egg or the ovum. And lastly, it also increases the sensitivity of the uterus to the hormone oxytocin. Now, oxytocin, what it does is, oxytocin is a hormone that brings about the contraction of the uterus at the end of pregnancy, which leads to childbirth. And now, estrogen brings about or increases the sensitivity of the uterus to oxytocin. Second, we have progesterone, which is the second female hormone. Now, second female hormone, progesterone, it prepares the uterus for implantation, growth and development of the fetus after fertilization. Once the female gamete or the egg or ovum is fertilized in the female reproductive tract by the male sperm, it has to get implanted in the wall of the uterus in order for pregnancy to begin. So now progesterone, what it does is it prepares the uterus for implantation, growth and development of the fetus. In other words, it maintains the normal course of pregnancy. That is why progesterone is also known as the pregnancy hormone. So these are the two female hormones which are secreted from the ovaries. Now if we look at the right hand side, given in red, are the male counterpart, which are the testes. Testes also performs two functions like the ovaries. Number one, it helps in the formation of sperms, which is the male gamete, and number two, it releases the male sex hormone known as testosterone. Now let us look at what testosterone does. Testosterone is secreted from the interstitial cells or the Leydig cells, which we've already discussed earlier. It aids in the development of the sex organs in males and also brings about the secondary sexual characters. Now again, secondary sexual characters in males are presence of facial hair, a lower register of voice as compared to the higher register in women, broader shoulders, more muscular development, aggressiveness. These are all secondary sexual characters in males which are brought about by testosterone. And lastly, it helps in or promotes spermatogenesis, which is the production and release of sperms, the male gamete. And lastly, it also increases your basal metabolic rate or BMR. So these are the functions of the two endocrine glands, ovaries and testes in females and males respectively, and the different hormones that are secreted by them. Now lastly, we must talk about two types of deficiency disorders, which are diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus. Now, diabetes mellitus is caused by the deficiency of insulin. Now, if insulin is in deficit, what happens is insulin cannot convert glucose into glycogen. Thus, the amount of glucose in our blood increases and causes a condition known as diabetes mellitus, which is caused by a deficiency of insulin. The symptoms include expulsion of glucose in the urine. You will find a lot of glucose in the person's urine, which is a condition known as glucosuria. It also leads to high blood sugar levels. If you compare it to the other type of diabetes is diabetes insipidus. It is a condition caused by the deficiency of another hormone called vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, which, if you remember, was earlier produced by the hypothalamus but stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary. Now, if you look at vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone as a hormone, its function is to stop or reduce diuresis, which is the release or which is the discharge of water in urine, which causes, now diuresis causes dehydration because you are losing water in your urine. Now, what vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone does, it induces or it stimulates or it initiates reabsorption of water from the urine in the uriniferous tubules in your kidney, thereby reducing the amount of water lost in your urine. However, if there is deficiency of vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, diuresis will occur, which results in the release of a large amount of water in your urine. Therefore, the symptoms of diabetes insipidus include frequent urination, thirst as a result, and dehydration. So these are the two important deficiency disorders that you need to know. One is diabetes mellitus caused due to deficiency of insulin. The other is diabetes insipidus caused due to deficiency of vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. Now with that, we come to the end of the third part of the chapter, where we've discussed about different animal hormones, which are the chemical messengers which perform or coordinate different physiological processes in the bodies of animals, through which the animals are able to bring about different types of responses to different types of stimuli present in the environment. Now with that, we also come to the end of our lesson.